Okay, we'll go ahead and get started as folks are still trickling in. Good afternoon and welcome to the panel discussion on how to publish a journal manuscript. My name is Tim Nelson, and I'm a professor in the psychology department at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and the associate director of the Radar Center. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'd especially like to welcome our distinguished panel and thank them for taking the time to share their expertise with us. This should be a great discussion, and I'm honored to have the opportunity to serve as moderator. Publishing in peer-reviewed journals is an essential activity for researchers. Journal articles are often the primary method for communicating the results of new research to professional audiences and create a lasting record of scientific findings. In addition to the contributions peer-reviewed journals make to their respective fields, publishing these papers is also critical to building an individual researcher's scholarly record and creating a foundation for career advancement and future work. It has been said that peer-reviewed publications are the currency of the realm in academia, and establishing a strong publication record is really often a prerequisite for promotion, tenure, and successfully competing for external funding. But the process can be challenging. Preparing, submitting, and revising manuscripts is intensive and time-consuming work. Rejection is common, so a thick skin and a resilient mindset are needed. Given the high stakes and the notable challenges, it's important to understand the process of publishing in peer-reviewed journals and to develop strategies to increase one's chance of success. Today, our panelists will draw on their considerable experience with journal publication to provide insights that I'm sure will be invaluable in navigating this process. So before we start our discussion, I want to give just a quick overview of the format for this panel. We will start with introductions, in which each panelist will take about 3 minutes or so to introduce themselves, talk about their background and broad perspectives on the topic of publishing journal manuscripts. Then I will ask the panelists a series of questions to start the discussion. And my approach here will be simply to get things started and then get out of the way and let these experts talk. So along those lines, I will encourage panelists to take the discussion wherever they see fit and to view my questions as mere prompts that should in no way limit them raising any other issues that they believe are important. Finally, the final 15 minutes or so of the session will be reserved for questions from the audience, which can be submitted via the Q&A feature. I'm still pretty new to moderating virtual panels, so I'm extremely grateful to the staff who will be helping me to monitor the Q&A and hopefully avoid any technical difficulties, so thank you. With that, I'd like to ask the panelists to each introduce themselves and tell us just a little bit about their backgrounds and perspectives on today's topic. So let's start with Dr. Picciotto.
Thank you so much, Tim, and welcome everybody. I'm very excited to be here. Please do start thinking of questions for the chat later, because we'd love to hear from you about what you're really interested in. So from my perspective, I have served a lot of roles in publishing. First, I learned to be a peer reviewer from my mentors, actually starting from my very early years in graduate school, where I was asked to co-review with my mentors. So I urge you guys to ask your mentors if you want to get involved, to learn to review with them. Then I published my first papers after doing work in graduate school and became reviewed on my own, and then played some editorial roles in a number of journals in the neuroscience realm. So I'm a neuroscientist. My work is on acetylcholine and its receptors. And in addition to handling manuscripts myself, a number of journals, including Neuroscience Letters, Journal of Neurochemistry, Nicotine and Tobacco Research, I now am editor-in-chief of the Journal of Neuroscience. So happy to answer any questions from any of those roles.
Great, thank you so much and welcome. Next, we have Nicole Weiss.
Hi, welcome everyone. I'm happy to be here today. I am an associate professor of clinical psychology at the University of Rhode Island and director of the Stress Lab. And I similarly feel like I have wide expertise in various domains of the publishing process. I've published nearly 170 peer-reviewed publications and currently serve on 3 editorial boards. So I'm looking forward to answering any questions you might have about the process.
Thank you. And then finally, we have Holly Andrella.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Holly Andrella, and I have a little bit of a different perspective than either Marina or Nicole. I am the Deputy Director of the WWAMI Rural Health Research Center, and we are a health workforce focused center. And that's how I sort of landed or bumbled my way into doing a lot of work on substance use disorder, and started publishing sort of a lot of information about the workforce that was providing care. I am on the editorial board of the Journal of Rural Health, and so I think that the rural piece is something that I could add to in this discussion. I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you.
Great, thank you so much, and welcome to our panel. Let's go ahead and jump in with some questions to get the conversation started. First question, finding a journal that is a good fit for your paper is a critical step in the publication process. Can you share some strategies for identifying an appropriate target journal? I'll just open it up to the panel.
Go ahead, Marina.
Oh, okay. So I think the key thing that I think about first is, who is the audience for this paper? Is it someone who's doing exactly what I do because it's important to my field, but maybe not so interesting to others who do something very different? Is it something that is important to all of my field, so all neuroscientists might be interested in this idea? Or is it something that might even be interesting to the general public, so a very broad audience, or someone who does a different kind of science? And so with that first step, then I can start looking at journals that have either a scope that is quite specific to what I do, a little more general in the field, or really broad. And then I look at the actual journals and see if there are any papers that are similar to what I'm hoping to publish. Is there someone else who's published this type of article in the journal I'm looking at? And if not, it's probably not going to be a great fit, and the reviewers may not review it the way I want them to. But if there are others that are sort of in the mold of what I'm trying to say, then I figure that's going to be a good place to start. And I'll turn it over to my fellow panelists.
Thanks, Marina. I agree with everything that Marina said. The one thing that I like to encourage people and researchers to do, because I have this rural focus, is to think about how what I'm doing could contribute. Maybe it's something that is very specific to a topic like Marina's neuroscience topic, but I'm going to take a different twist on it, and I'm going to focus on the rural population and how this might impact them differently. So when I'm choosing a journal, I think about that. The other thing that I use as a starting place is, quite frankly, articles that I've referenced that are talking about a topic that I'm interested in. Okay, so this paper is publishing about something, I'm building on that work, and so perhaps that would be an important thing. And then the last thing I would say is just the type of paper that I'm thinking of writing, and does it fit with that particular journal in terms of length and style and so forth.
I'll just jump off of that. I think that you both touched several of the points that I had kind of taken some notes on here. I would say the one other factor that I oftentimes consider is not only what the journal that I'm looking at might have published, but what it's publishing currently, because I think that's also very important. What a journal was publishing 10 years ago might not be what it's publishing right now. So oftentimes, I spend some time looking at my references to see who I'm citing, what kinds of journals those are, but I also then go to look to see what those particular journals are publishing now. And that gives me a good framework for understanding fit with that journal given current priorities. The other thing that I know we do, and perhaps other folks do, is that we have this constantly updated list in our lab of journals that fall along specific themes, right? So like substance use journals or trauma journals or general psychiatry journals. And so we try to, keep that updated so that that can just be a really quick and easy place where we can go look, see what's the impact factor, what are the requirements of the journal. So does the page length kind of map what we've developed, and so on and so forth. And that's worked well for us.
If I could jump in, one more thing that I would urge people to do, which I think many people do, but maybe not everyone, is to go to the instructions for authors, where there's often a quite clear definition of the scope for each journal. And of course, very clear, hopefully, instructions on the format once you decide on a journal to submit to. And those are generally very easy to find online, and is another good starting point to either rule out a particular journal because maybe it only publishes review articles and you didn't know, or choose it or confirm that you've made a good choice. I just do want to push back a little bit on something that Dr. Weiss said, which is that I know that journal impact factors are important for some institutions, in particular for promotion and so on. But I want to remind everybody that, in fact, what's really important is how many people look at and see your paper, right? So that's what's important. Can they find it? And will they then use it for their work and cite it? So even if you are in a journal that has other articles that are not highly cited, and therefore the journal impact factor may be lower, or other articles that are extremely highly cited and you're not sure if yours will fit, go with topic fit first. If it's really important for your particular institution to look at journal impact factor, do that. But I think the field as a whole is trying to push back on reflected glory.
Great, thank you for those great points and wonderful discussion. I'm going to ask a question that kind of builds off of this idea of thinking about audience and who you want to reach and how to reach audience. So what are your thoughts on open access publishing versus more standard or non-open access publication? And particularly thinking about that for early career scientists, what are the considerations there?
Well, I don't have a lot to say about this, but I think the cost is the big thing. You can say, oh, I want to do open access, but unless you have the funds to do that, and many people don't, then you're sort of out of luck. And so I think there has been, a lot of discussions about, buying publications and so forth. I can't really comment on that, but I can say that for a lot of the work, I just haven't had the funds available that I could use for that.
Yeah, that was, oh, sorry, go.
No, go for it.
I was just going to say that was one of my highlights, especially for early career folks, that you might not have the funds to support that work. I mean, the other thing is that there are definitely, I think, some reputable open access journals, right? But that there are also some journals that are open access that are more predatory. So it would be important to be able to make sure that, whatever the source you're going to perhaps aligns with your values in publishing as well, and in scientific rigor. So those would be considerations.
Yeah, those are such good points. And the one other thing that I would say is that a commitment to open access doesn't have to come through the journal itself. If you choose a journal that is not open access but allows preprints, and most do, you can actually publish your preprint at any time, but perhaps at the time that you're sending it out for peer review as well. And therefore, the community can start to use the data that you've generated and see what you've done without a cost, in a form that is currently being reviewed by a journal. And that's one way of having complementary streams of information. So I think peer review is absolutely critical. I'm a firm believer that peer review makes my papers much better. It has consistently over the years, and it's a way, it's not perfect, but it's a way for the community to weigh in on things that we're often too close to see some of the flaws. And so I'm completely committed to publishing all my work in peer-reviewed journals. However, I'm also an advocate for rapidly getting results out to the community so that other people don't have to duplicate things that we've already done, or are able to move on to the next step of their work. And so a complementary way to do that is to get the first version out to the public as soon as possible as a preprint, even while improving your work by going through the peer review process. So that's one way to have it both ways.
I'm glad the topic of preprints came up. This is something I was gonna ask about. Perhaps the panel could share other considerations in thinking about preprints and when to do that and how to do that. We've seen more of that, particularly the pandemic stimulated a lot of that to great value. But there's also some risks in getting things out there in what may not be its final form. Can folks talk a little bit about those considerations and how to approach that?
Well, I'm happy to jump in again because I'm a talker. I think the risks of putting out information that is publicly very relevant before peer review are great, right? If you have for example, an article that has implications for current public health, as in development of new vaccines or treatments for COVID in real time, there is an enormous risk of getting it wrong. And there's also an enormous risk of waiting. So the ways to de-risk that, of course, are to get internal feedback from experts if you're going to publish a preprint, so you don't just throw things out there that you're not that you've had no other opinions on. So that's one way to slightly de-risk the process. If there's something that's really controversial and is not potentially of immediate life-saving effect, then it's good to wait until you get feedback from reviewers and that you argue them through. But I think overall the risks of preprints are decreasing. I mean, I think people worried that they wouldn't get credit because someone would jump in with a peer-reviewed manuscript, but preprints have a date. So if you have a preprint out there, you can point to the date of your discovery if priority is important. I think news media have started to use preprints a little bit more responsibly. So I think overall, as people get used to another way of disseminating scientific information, some of those risks are being mitigated, but it's important to be responsible as a scientist and not put something that could be either really misinterpreted or misused out there before you get other scientists to comment on it.
Other thoughts or additional perspectives about preprints? We're all kind of figuring this out as it's a relatively newer idea. Other thoughts? Okay. We can circle back to these issues as I'm sure they'll relate to some of the other questions. I want to get into some more kind of questions about the mechanics of going about publishing peer-reviewed papers. One question is that many journals ask authors to suggest specific reviewers for their submissions. I will personally say I always find this to be a very difficult part of the process, and I don't actually like when I'm asked to do that. What are your tips for identifying and suggesting potential reviewers?
I do something quite similar to what I do in terms of identifying journals, and that's first thing is go to my reference list just to see who I'm citing in the paper. And I figure those are probably the people that are in the best position to evaluate the quality of my work. I would say that another thing that I've been increasingly doing is also doing searches to see who's publishing in this area now. And I'm looking more so at early career folks who might be really interested in getting more experience with the manuscript review process and who might not be getting the same level of requests as some of the senior folks that I'm citing within my paper. So I try to balance those as I'm making choices around who to recommend.
Great suggestions. Other thoughts about the challenge of coming up with reviewers.
I just want, I was just going to say that I love the idea, and we try to do this too, of getting the our more junior colleagues into the review process by naming the first author rather than the last author of the papers that we've cited. Senior postdocs are very close to the work and exceptionally experienced already. And graduate students have a lot of knowledge that can be used for peer review. So I agree. Sorry, Holly, I cut you off.
That's okay. I was gonna say similar things, so it's fine. We can move on.
Great. As a follow-up to that, for those of us who do work that is interdisciplinary and brings together different fields, do you have any recommendations about strategies for identifying reviewers who might have different areas of expertise and cover? So if there aren't folks who are necessarily doing work at that intersection of fields, how you might select potential reviewers who come from respective fields that you're drawing from? Or yes, please, Marina.
Sorry, I don't want to monopolize the conversation. But I would say that there are real challenges to that, because what happens is that you'll get a reviewer who's an expert in one area of your interdisciplinary research, an expert who's in another area of your interdisciplinary research, and your editor will see that they have different concerns, and therefore there's twice as many concerns, and it can be really challenging to get interdisciplinary research published. So a couple things that I would say is that if there's anyone who's working at the same interface, call on them for sure. And then in your cover letter, give your editor a heads up that you are pioneering the interface between two fields, so that when they get these discrepant reviews from people in very different areas, maybe they're primed to say, okay, well, but this is risky and may make people in one field a little uncomfortable, and in the other field a little uncomfortable, because it's taking both fields in a new direction. So alert your editor to what's happening. And then in the end, what you really have to do is maybe make, again, in your letter to the editor, a couple of lists and say, for this aspect of the study, here's some people. For the other aspect of the study, here's some people. And just, make them aware that it's going to be a tougher review process.
That's really helpful, and raises a new issue of how you communicate with editors. And specifically, you mentioned the cover letter, and this is one particular way that you might use the cover letter to prime an editor for how they assign your article or how they read it. Can you talk a little bit about your approach to cover letters and what you're trying to communicate in a cover letter? What is appropriate, what is not appropriate for a cover letter? And I know folks probably apply to really different journals, and so I'd love to hear different perspectives on the approach to the cover letter.
My approach is pretty basic, and I actually will just tell you that I keep a cover letter kind of, I don't want to say draft, but I have a sort of canned cover letter that I adjust and use every time. So just to save myself work, right? And I make the point of why I think this, there's a number of things that sometimes you're instructed to address. And I make sure that, that I follow the instructions. And Marina said earlier, go and get the author instructions. I would say that that's just so crucial to follow, read them, and then do what they say. And it sounds really basic, but you'd be surprised how many people don't do that. And then I just try and spell out for the editor what the contribution is that I'm, that this paper is making, and why it's important, and who it might be important to. And then, I'm a less is more kind of person, and so it's not a super long thing, but that's my approach.
I have a very similar approach. I have a template, and I think I don't deviate much from that template. I obviously adhere to journal requirements. And so, certain journals have certain requirements for the cover letter, but I will say that one exception to that rule is if I'm publishing in an area where I feel like it's newer and that perhaps the editor might benefit from some background or additional information to kind of convince them of the importance of what I'm doing. I'll usually like drop a few sentences into the cover letter just to further underscore the importance of that work so that it's very clear to whomever it is that's evaluating the manuscript.
Hey, great advice. Let's move on to what happens after the initial review. So most papers will have to go through some kind of revision process before they're accepted for publication. In many cases, a substantial revision process. So can you talk a little bit about your approach to revise and resubmit requests and share some tips for navigating this process?
I'll start if you want, and then Nicole and Marina can add on. One of the things that I think is really important as a person that reviews many, many papers is that you make it easy for the reviewer to see that you have addressed their concerns. So the very first thing that I do when I get a review back is I make a 2-column table where I have the reviewer's comment on the left-hand column, and then I have my response in the right-hand column for every single comment that they make, so that then when it comes back to me as a reviewer, I can see they've addressed everything. Here's how they've addressed it. I can go back to the manuscript and see it, but they've provided an explanation, a context. They've agreed or disagreed, they've pushed back. But I think just the simple act of organizing your response in a really clear way will help you with reviewers as they're looking at your changes. So I would say for me, that's a really important thing for people to do.
I similarly, I agree with that suggestion. The other thing that I really try to pay attention to as I'm responding to reviewers is that I want the reviewer to know that I'm being as responsive as possible to their suggestions and that I value their suggestions. This can sometimes be pretty challenging because I don't always agree with their suggestions. And so I think that in those circumstances, I still try to think about how can I make a change to my manuscript, as long as it doesn't make it less rigorous, that kind of is aligned with whatever concern it is that they may have raised. Because even if I feel like that data, for instance, was already in the manuscript that I submitted, obviously I'm not presenting the data clearly enough would be perhaps one takeaway message that I might leave with. And so there's some need to do revision of writing so that all people who are accessing my paper will be able to clearly understand the message that I'm trying to send. So my general approach to reviews is to always do something, even if I don't fully agree, as long as it doesn't make it less rigorous. And that this, in my opinion, being on the other side of the table in the reviewer's shoes is something that I also appreciate when folks do. So that's one thing.
I could not agree more. That's exactly right. I figure that if, so there are a few things where you might not agree with the reviewer. One is that, they say, I think this is really the point, that they say it wasn't in there and you're like, it was in there. Take it to heart. Say, okay, if they didn't see it, I didn't put it in a place or in a way that the reviewers could see. So reword it, put it more prominently, move it, add more if you can. And then sometimes it's interpretation in the discussion where the reviewer doesn't agree with your interpretation. I try to change or at least temper or add in other caveats to the discussion when the reviewer doesn't agree with me. Not saying that I say, oh, of course, the reviewer is right and I'm not, but to add some nuance so that those reading it can understand that there may be multiple ways to look at or to put our work into context, because what's key is the data. And then the interpretation may change both for me and for the reviewers and the readers over time. And so in the discussion, leaving open-ended ways for that data to be interpreted by the field, I think is a good thing. And making a marker for how I think things work is usually how I'm trying to sort of force my opinion on others. And I realize that that's maybe not, it's not timely yet. So I am very flexible about changing discussion, or at least tempering and adding different things to the discussion. One thing that we try to do in our lab, if we can, is when there is a possibility that we have data that are relevant to the concern raised, we try to add data whenever we can, or add analyses if they ask for more analyses. It can take more time, but what it does is it really does exactly what Nicole was saying. It shows that we're taking the reviews seriously. And unless it harms the paper, or unless we really can't do the experiment, or it would take a lot of time and resources, then it's worth adding to the paper if we can.
I would also just add that, you know, if you feel like the reviewer's wrong or that they missed something, you know, my general approach here is not to be like, you were wrong, it's here, but more to just like say, you know, here's this information. I try to do a little revising of language to make it a little more clear, but I don't like let them know that they missed it. Really, I just say like the information can be found here. They don't know whether that's newly added or not. I'm trying to remember that I want them to have a positive impression of me, because they're making a decision about whether they believe my work should be published. And so that's an important part of the process. I was also, well, actually, I'll pause here. I don't know if we want to say anything about responsivity. I had a other kind of tangential thought about my approach to revise and resubmissions.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead. This is a great time.
I was also going to say that I do this a lot with my grad students, just in terms of like, you get this request for a resubmission. What do you do, right? What's the next step there? And I think that what's worked really well for me in terms of mentoring folks who are earlier in their careers than myself is that essentially I say to them, take all those comments that you got and put them in a document, and just make a couple of notes about what you think you want to do. And when you get to the end of that, let's meet and have a conversation. And I think that's really important, because sometimes you're going to get reviewers who are asking you to do very different things. And so you're going to have to be really thoughtful about, how am I going to do the thing reviewer one's asking me to do and the thing that reviewers two asking me to do, because they kind of contradict each other in some respects. So I think it's really important to really not wait and do it all at once, but to give yourself some space to really think about what it is that you are going to do. And then once you've had that time to really look at that review in a more holistic way, to then actually start making those changes. The other piece of advice that I would have is, don't ever do it in one day if you can help it. And the reason for that is that sometimes you're going to feel some emotions as you're going through the process. Like sometimes you're really going to feel like frustrated, because you're going to be like, that person is wrong. And I know that as I was, you know, in my postdoc, for instance, my postdoc mentor would say to me, okay, I can feel your emotion in this response right now. I think you need to take a day and come back to it and revise some of your language there. Not that I was, you know, explicitly expressing frustration, but that she could sense in reading my response document that, yeah, you're probably a little frustrated by the request that's coming to you. So that would be another piece of advice. Try not to do it in one day. Give yourself some space, especially if you're noticing yourself feeling some frustration about the requests that you're getting.
I think that's really good advice, Nicole. And I would similarly say that, you know, sometimes it's really hard not to take it personally. The other thing that I would say, two things, is one, most of the papers that I'm working on are part of a team. And so we might gather the team and sort of, I'll say, put the comments in that table that I described, and then sort of figure out who's the best person. It won't always be me to address it or whoever it is on the team. I'm actually a biostatistician, so if it's a statistical question, then I might be the person. If it's, you know, some other topic, somebody else might be a better person to do that. And the other thing that I think is really important is it's okay to not change your paper. I mean, it's okay to push back. I don't think you can push back on every single thing, but I think you can explain why you're not changing it. And you can say something like, and we respectfully defer to the editor if they sort of insist that this is why we don't want to do it. But and then we can respectfully defer, and somebody else can say, yeah, they don't have to change it, or no, we do want you to change it. So, I mean, we sometimes do that when we don't want to make a change for whatever reason it is.
This is such good advice on all parts. And I would just add to the don't do it in one day by saying the emotion is a big part of it. Sleeping on it can sometimes give you at least a little distance, and having someone else reread your comments for motion is really helpful. But the other thing that I find that I do is, you know, I had questions about my study, and maybe I had concerns about the study, and I'll read the comments and I'll imagine that the question is actually addressing the central question in my head. And I may not actually read fully for content the first time, because I'll assume, oh yes, of course they caught what I was worried about. Read the comments more than once, because sometimes what you're answering is not actually what they're asking. And it comes from an internal dialogue that you've already had with yourself. And the more that you actually read for their content, the more likely you're able to address exactly what was asked.
These are some great tips and really consistent with a lot of the experiences that I've had as well. I know I said that we would save audience questions for later, but we actually have one that's right on topic now. So I'll just pivot to that. Ken asked, do you have any thoughts on strategies to deal with unhelpful or even hostile peer reviewers?
I don't think this is, for me, has been a regular occurrence. I can think of probably 2 times where I've gotten reviews where I was concerned that there might be some bias occurring in terms of like a person's research program impacting like how they were evaluating the research, my research, and that it came out as feeling a little hostile. And I think that my approach to that is just not to respond with hostility, to do exactly what I would do in any other review, which is I'm going to try to hear what your concerns are. I'm going to try to respond to those as best I can. I'm going to acknowledge any points that you raise that have validity and integrate them into my manuscript. You have a perspective. It is perhaps different than my own, and that's okay. That's what science is. So I guess I try not to respond with hostility. That's tough though.
That's what I was going to say. I would treat it just like any other review, go through the process. And I think it's really important when you're writing your responses that you write in a non-hostile, respectful way. And I think, that's all you can do, really.
Yeah, I have just a couple of things to add. The first is unhelpful reviews are sometimes reviews that seem to have missed my point. And we sort of talked about that, which means that I didn't make my point, I think, clearly enough. So I will revise the language to try to even be more clear about what the central message is or whatever they missed. I'll point out to them kindly. I think Nicole said this. Oh, you can find, we have data on this on page X, trying not to say it was always there, but trying to point them to things that may redirect their perspective. So that's not a hostile one. That's they missed it. And then I'll take it as, okay, I need to express myself a little more clearly. If you do get hostile reviews, as in you get language that is actually directly hostile, do point it out to the editors. the editors should always read the reviews, but maybe they missed it. And if so, it's really important to let them know that they have a non-collegial reviewer who is really doing them a disservice as a journal. Because I can tell you from the editor's perspective, we will make a note of that, and that person will not be invited to re-review. We are looking for people who actually engage collegially with the authors. And if they use any language that's disparaging, or I don't know how anyone could be so stupid as to think X, I don't want them ever to review for me again. And so if you highlight that to the reviewer and to the editors, hopefully that will begin to take that reviewer out of the pool.
Okay, great advice on some of those kind of specific issues and difficult situations. I want to take a step back and think a bit more in terms of broad strategy here. So what is your advice to early career scientists in terms of publishing priorities? For example, how should early career scientists think about things like what they publish, with whom they publish, where they publish, how much they publish, kind of broader strategic publishing priorities. Please share your thoughts on that.
I'll go ahead and start with this. I recently went up for tenure this past year, so I'm kind of feel a little more connected to some of the pressures around publishing and the tenure process, if that's what other folks are going through. So I took a couple of notes on this question, and I think one of the biggest take homes for me is you don't want to give up the quality for the quantity. But I think that you weigh that with also recognizing that there's going to be expectations for publishing. I think those obviously differ quite substantially across fields. In clinical psychology, which is my field, they're quite high. And so for me, when I'm talking to other folks in my field, I say to them, you want to try to find a way to publish 2 to 3 manuscripts a year, with at least one of those being first author. And you have to kind of have some serious reflection around your research program. Some of our research programs, are the methods that we're applying in our research, take a little bit longer to publish. We might be doing community engaged research. We might be doing qualitative studies that require a lot of more time on the front end, but also a lot of time on the back end of processing the actual data. And so for folks who have research programs where they're using those more intensive methods that might take a little bit longer, I suggest to them, hey, is there a way to think about broadening your research program a little bit so that you're using different methods, or you have different lines of research that support this larger research goal that you're working towards, but that perhaps like one line of this research is a little slower, right? So it's this maybe like this community engaged research that's going to take a little bit longer to publish, but that you also have this line of research where you're still doing good science, you're publishing rigorous research, but you're able to move from like start to finish a little more quickly. So those might be what some of the conversations look like that I'm having with more junior folks.
I completely agree. And I was not super good at being strategic during my training, except in this one thing, which was that the thing that I thought about very carefully was to have a diverse portfolio of projects. And that is that you do need to show productivity in order to get grant funding. So if you are waiting for a home run for 4 years and you publish a landmark paper, you still may not get a grant, because grant committees like to see that you're regularly making contributions to the field. So you can do it exactly as Nicole mentioned, which is you have some projects that are very time intensive, perhaps really risky in some ways, and you're hoping for that home run. And you also have smaller papers where perhaps you're publishing the methods, perhaps you're publishing the controls, or you're confirming or replicating things that are really important for your field that perhaps take less time. And of course, that's always, that's a big perhaps, because some of the things that I always thought would take no time at all were the ones that took a long time, and vice versa. But if you have small side projects in addition to a main big project, then you're more likely to make sure that you start to check the boxes of the very different things that you'll be judged on. Some people will want to see that you're regularly productive, and that means, 1 or 2 papers a year. Others will want to see that you're really influencing how the whole world thinks. So that means every once in a while getting a home run. And others will be looking for progress in a particular area because maybe your department is very focused on a particular type of outcome. So the more that you are mindful of what you will be judged on, and that you are giving some credence to the various ways that you will be evaluated, the more you'll be able to sort of, again, diversify your portfolio.
Great. I want to remind the audience that you can submit your questions through the Q&A feature. I don't see any at the moment. Devin will let me know if I'm missing anything. I'll keep posing questions to the panel just to keep this great conversation going. But as you have those questions, please put those in so that we can pose them to the panel. I wanted to ask another question about responding to reviewers, and particularly the situation where reviewers may not be familiar with your methods or may need some educating around those methods, particularly if you're using statistical approaches or other methodologies that you know better than they do. How you kind of balance that education with also wanting to please reviewers enough to get your paper accepted. So I know folks here have a variety of roles, including focusing more on the methodology of some studies. So maybe talk a little bit about that particular situation.
In those cases, that happens for me quite regularly. I would say that perhaps somebody doesn't have much expertise in some of the methods I'm applying. I respond really positively to that and actually thank them for giving me the opportunity to be able to provide more detail in the manuscript regarding the methods that I'm utilizing in my study. And I feel like this integrated knowledge will make the audience more well-versed in, whatever it is I'm sharing with them. So I basically say that, and then I just add a little bit more into the manuscript in terms of what methods or data analytic approaches I'm utilizing. And in those scenarios, actually, I make a point to not try to teach the reviewer about it. I essentially am trying to let the reviewer know that I'm thinking that it's not that they're asking because they don't know, but more that they think that the audience that might be reading my paper may not know. And so thank you for giving me this opportunity to do this, but I'm not going to explain it to them because they may already know. I don't want to make the assumption they don't know. So that's my approach, and nobody's given me a hard time about that.
Other perspectives on that?
I love that approach. We sometimes get suggestions for other ways to look at the data, which we don't, especially because we're working out new methods in some of the areas, like particularly fibrophotometry data, where we get a lot of data and it's a new method. So people are trying to figure out what's the best statistical analysis to do. And so we'll sometimes take the advice and use a different method. It can sometimes be time consuming to reanalyze the data, hopefully with a similar outcome, and show that, look, this is robust data across these different ways of analysis. We actually come to similar conclusions. And usually we won't, we picked our methods of analysis for a reason. And so, we won't necessarily publish both, although we have sometimes published both methods side by side to show why one might be more robust than another. And sometimes if it's, similarly, if we're in a field where people are working out how to do this the best way, we'll provide raw code whenever we can. We provide raw code so others can use the method, or in some way increase the utility of the method that we're using if it's new.
Oh, Holly, you're muted.
There we go. Yeah,
Okay.
I was on a, I've actually had this problem, not very often. I mean, once recently where, I can't remember all the exact particulars, but it was with a regression, and the person, I'm a statistician, and their complaint was so off base. Responded in a very kind of generic way the first time, got another, like another revision, at which point had to write a let me teach you about regression, a couple of paragraphs, and then that was it. It was fine at that point. But so sometimes you do have to teach them if they really don't know and they are really not right.
Great. We do have a question from the audience, so I want to pivot to that. And this actually picks up on a theme that we were discussing earlier. So Patrick asked, as editors and board members, do you think the push for open access risks creating tiered research communities? Those who have the funding to publish many times, those who may only be able to do one per year, and those without any resources at all for open access publishing. Long term, does this change the nature of the work that is published?
I feel pretty strongly that the answer is I have very similar concerns. That one of the advantages of our current method of paying for publication is that the costs are spread. Yes, libraries at institutions do pay for subscriptions, and that means that authors have to pay less or nothing at all. And if we move to an entirely author-funded publication process, we do risk having multiple tiers, those who can and those who cannot afford to publish. I do think that in the end, this will have to be something that governments end up stepping into. If the United States government, for example, mandates publishing in open access journals, then they are also going to have to fund the publication fees. That is that NIH is going to have to upfront find a way to actually, without pushing these costs onto authors, fund publication costs in a more general way. And I don't think they want to do that. So I think that there's going to be a lot of wrestling in the United States about how to deal with these mandates for open access. Of course, what we know is that ERA Commons was established as a way to juggle between the desire for open access and then the fact that existing methods of publication do spread the costs. That is, ERA Commons mandates any research that was funded with the NIH dollars to be open access after a year. And the way that it is open access is not in its final fancy form, but so that all the figures and data are there on ERA Commons, and anyone in the world can go into ERA Commons and find it open access. That may not be tenable over time. That 1 year lag may not work out. And there may have to be new ways to, again, perhaps work between a preprint world and a published world. But I do think that the center of that is equity. And I don't think there is equity in the current push for universal open access, because many of our great authors cannot afford to pay very high publication fees. So I share your concern.
Okay, I don't see other questions from the audience, so I'll pivot to another one of mine. So we've talked a little bit about communicating with reviewers as well as editors. I want to ask more specifically, what is your advice for communicating with journal editors? When is it appropriate or not appropriate to contact an editor with questions or concerns, and how do you approach communicating with an editor?
I'm happy to start here. I don't typically have much communication with an editor. I would say that I think there are only a few instances of times I can think of where I did that. I imagine that some people might be thinking that you perhaps might communicate in advance regarding fit of a paper. I've heard folks talk about that, and I do think that I've met folks in editorial roles who are open to that and understand that there might be significant amount of work that goes into preparing a manuscript for a journal. And that if it's kind of, as long as you provide all the data and it's a quick and easy process for them to be able to quickly determine fit with journal. I think another time we might be considering reaching out to an editor would be if there seems to be some delay in the review process, which we're all experiencing right now. And so my general advice there, or my practice, is to try not to act on the urge to reach out too early, and to be understanding of the fact that there's a bit of a backlog right now, and to just be patient, but that there are certain circumstances that might warrant reaching out. So for instance, if you notice that your manuscript has been kind of sitting in a like non-assigned position for a couple of months, waiting for reviewers, that might be a time that I perhaps would reach out to an editor. If you notice that the reviews have come back and it's been sitting again for not just like a week, but a pretty significant amount of time, that might be a time that I might just check on the manuscript, because I also recognize that editors are people like us who are busy, and that sometimes things slip between the cracks. The last time kind of instance where I reached out to editors is times where I've disagreed with a decision. I was very hesitant to do that when I was, in my earlier stages, and I regularly do that now. And to be honest with you, it's always gone in my favor. So there's been at least, I would say, 3 or 4 times where we've gotten back some feedback, and there's been a rejection, and we just disagree based on the reviewer feedback. And we've contested it, and the editors have given us an opportunity to respond, and we've ultimately had our work published in that journal. So also a word of encouragement to, if you disagree with a decision, there's no harm in respectfully reaching out to an editor to kind of ask for some further clarification.
At the Journal of Neuroscience, we've formalized both that pre-submission and appeal process. So if you are not sure that your manuscript will fit, there's a formal pre-submission inquiry button, and you push it and you upload your abstract and a cover letter, and then the editors who would be evaluating your manuscript respond to you as soon within a few days about fit. So that kind of pre-submission inquiry process we've formalized. And similarly, if you don't agree with a decision, there's a formal appeal button. You push it, it's in the decision, in the part of the record where your decision is. And for the Journal of Neuroscience, we have very clear guidelines. So if there's any technical error on the part of a reviewer, that's automatically a basis for appeal. The editor may or may not agree that there's a technical error, but let's say your reviewer says, your method does this and it doesn't do that, it does this, always appeal. And then it will almost always be sent back out for review. Sometimes it's because they have asked for more data, and the editors has said, well, this is too much. We won't require you to do a year of work, so we're going to reject it. But you happen to have done some of those experiments, or you think that they're doable, push back with more data. Sometimes that will be a really good basis for appeal. If in the end it is an opinion versus an opinion, then it's worth trying, but I would say that's much less likely to be successful. So for example, if a reviewer says, I do not think that this outcome is novel or relevant to a broad audience, and you say, well, it is novel and it is relevant for a broad audience. If you have data, or if you have reasons that that's novel and important for a broad audience, put it in there. Give as much evidence as you can to push back. But opinion, like they're wrong, this is novel, is usually not going to work.
Great. Well, we are actually just about out of time now. So I want to close by thanking our panel so much for this wonderful discussion and for sharing their time and insight. I want to thank the audience for joining us and for your questions. And so I hope everyone has a great day, and we hope to see you at an upcoming session of the symposium. Thank you, everyone.